Well, welcome back to episode 6 of the Citizens Playbook. Many of us grew up watching I'm Just a Bill.
Conjunction,
Do you remember?
junction,
Yeah.
what's
Okay,
your
all right, yeah.
function?
The reality is far more complicated and almost like a brutal obstacle course. And so welcome back to Citizens Playbook. I'm Joe Henning.
And I'm Judge Stephen Knights Jr. Today, we are exploring the legislative branch. To give a firsthand perspective, we're joined by former Georgia Congresswoman Carolyn Bourdeaux. Congresswoman, welcome.
All right. Good to be here.
Wonderful. Yes, I look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Congresswoman, you represented Georgia's 7th congressional district in the U.S. House. Structurally, that chamber is designed to be the voice of the people right now, fast-paced, highly responsive, and running for re-election every 2 years. How does that hyper-reactive environment in the House clash with the institutional personality of the U.S. Senate, which was designed to be much more slow and deliberative?
Well, of course, I actually used to teach this subject back at Georgia State at the Andrew Young School. So I'm very familiar with the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill. I used to play that for my classes, as well as a number of different parody versions of that are out there now that are just hilarious. So yes, what you find is that the House is much bigger. It tends to operate on a much more rigorous schedule as well. So let's just think about a couple dimensions. 435 members. It takes 218 to get a bill across the line. You're a member of Congress. There are more of them. They represent a smaller constituency than most senators, though there are some very small states.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing to know about that is your member of Congress is relatively accessible to you. You can call up their district office, ask to meet with their staff, ask to meet with them. You can come to Washington and meet with them. They're much more accessible than people realize. I remember meeting with some of my constituents, and then I was getting ready to take the plane out from DCA, the Reagan Airport, and they were all there, and we just sat around, we talked, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, you're a real person." And I'm like, yeah, your members of Congress, they're real people. Now the senators, right, are definitely, they have much bigger constituencies. Their schedules are much more heavily controlled just because they have so many more people that they have to respond to. So that's very important to know. However, if you were thinking about moving legislation, if you're thinking about advancing an agenda, one thing to know about the House, it is very regimented because there are so many people that have to be corralled at any given time. It tends to operate on a more disciplined schedule, shall we say. The Senate is very free-flowing. Senators have an enormous amount of power to influence the process. So if you can get them to advocate for something for you, because they have access to the filibuster, because any senator can, in effect, stop action on any single bill. Once you get a senator on your side, you really, really do have the ability to get a lot done. Whereas on the House side, these folks are, again, in this regimented process. It is very, very controlled by the majority party. Whereas in the Senate, the minority party has a lot more say in what happens, because any single senator can invoke a filibuster and cause debate to stop and a negotiation to happen.
Well, Congresswoman, it's interesting you said that because from a business and community leadership perspective, we often see a bill that may pass from the House with a lot of momentum, and that bill may completely stall out when it crosses over to the Senate. In your experience navigating the bicameral tension, how did the Senate's unique rules, like the filibuster that you just mentioned, forces your colleagues in the House to change their legislative strategy from the very beginning?
Okay, well, there's a funny saying among members of Congress where they, in particular the House members, where they will say, the other party is the loyal opposition and the Senate is the enemy. So now we've become very polarized, so it's less the fact in this day and age. But nonetheless, there is a lot of institutional tension between the two sides. I actually was staff. I've served back in my younger days in the early 90s. I was staff to members of Congress and to senators. And so I know a lot about the two different chambers just from serving in that role. And I used to joke, and it is not entirely untrue, that a staff member on the Senate side has more power than a member of Congress on the House side often. And This is, again, it goes to that issue of the filibuster. So what is the filibuster? The filibuster is a rule that it requires 60 votes to close down debate on any bill and to force a vote on the actual underlying bill. What this has come to mean de facto is that pretty much any bill going through the Senate has to get a supermajority, not just a mere majority, but a supermajority. Further, the way that this actually functionally operates in the Senate is that there is a procedural motion called a hold. And that is where a senator can come in and say, I am putting a hold on this piece of legislation because I intend to filibuster it. Once they do and put that hold on there, all of a sudden, that kicks it down the line as something that's going to take a lot of effort and negotiation to get through the Senate. And so what has happened is, to my mind, this process has become abused to the point where pretty much if a senator says they're going to put a hold on the bill, unless it's a super important priority for the Senate, for the president, for instance, for someone to really move it through, often that will end up killing the bill entirely. And so that's why you see this deal where, things move to the House. The House has got regular order. It's majority rules only, no supermajority. So whoever controls the House, they move things through the process at a rapid clip, goes to the Senate, dies a terrible death. I think there's a good conversation that needs to be had about fixing some of these institutional rules. Congress has become extremely sclerotic, frozen up. But, for the moment, the reality that we're dealing with right now, that is how things are working.
Right. And let's look at committee structure and, looking at these bills that come up and the screening process and that. How much of a bill's survival comes down to that public debate versus the procedural power within that committee, specifically around chairs?
All right. If you go to your classic, how a bill becomes a law, right? there is that process, right? Which was, pretty reasonable, if pretty labor intensive. So the idea is a bill gets introduced. It is then assigned to a committee. It will then often be assigned to a subcommittee. That subcommittee will take up and debate the bill. Then they will do something called markup, where they will amend the bill. They will then send it to the full committee, their marked up version, if they pass it, right? And then the full committee will hold hearings. They will debate it. They will go through a markup. If they pass it out after amendment, then it will go to the full floor of the House or Senate, right? They will then debate the bill. They will amend the bill. They will pass it. It will go to the other chamber. The other chamber will go through the same process, either in parallel or after they have received the bill from the other chamber. Ultimately, some version will pass the House and the Senate. They will then meet in conference committee, and the conference will hammer out the differences between the two chambers, and then the exact same bill will then pass the House and Senate, and that will go to the president. That seems hard enough to me. I don't know about you, but
Absolutely.
into that process, right? We have added things like the filibuster, holds, all of these other things, particularly on the Senate side, that really, really shut down action. So one of the things everybody should be aware of is that the way things are often working in this day and age is scenarios where the House and the Senate leadership meet separately. These are often called, in budget bills, it's called the four corners will meet, which is the majority and minority leader in the House and the Senate, or the speaker and the minority leader in the House. And they will meet and they will hammer out what these bills are going to be, really independent of the committee structure, more or less. There's some committee action, but it is very much controlled and moved by the leadership. And that's happening more and more just because the system has become so dysfunctional.
Well, Congresswoman, to the average person or citizen looking from their TVs at home or just observing, it may seem like Washington can look like a broken system. We've discussed on this Citizens Playbook podcast time and time again that the founders intentionally engineered friction into the federal machine to force durable consensus. From your perspective and vantage point as a policy expert and lawmaker, is this pacing problem maybe a bug or is it a vital safety feature?
And that's a very good question. And I think, many people looking at it from different perspectives may come up to different conclusions. One of the problems from my perspective, and I do look at this from, have looked at this from a very high level. I have a PhD in public policy, for instance, right? And so I have looked at this from many different perspectives, not only being down in the weeds of the process, but also sort of thinking about, what the intent was, what the founders were trying to accomplish. I have my students read the Federalist Papers, read the Constitution, and we spend a lot of time talking about this and about democratic processes. The thing to realize is, yes, right, of course, they did want to slow action. They created this bicameral system to do it. And the process that I just described to you earlier, sort of the how a bill becomes a law process, is generally what they originally envisioned. And that is a very rigorous and demanding process. What has happened, though, is that Congress has layered on other pieces, such as the filibuster, such as these holds. And what has ended up happening is that Congress has gotten to the point where it is not able to take action on things that we really do need addressed. And that has become a real problem. And I currently work a lot on looking at our federal budget process, which is a absolute wreckage of a process. Congress has not passed a budget on time since 1996. Just to give you a sense of how bad that is. And even since the 1970s, it has only passed a budget on time, I believe, about 4 times. So 1996 was just a lucky year for us that we actually got it done. And that suggests a process that is broken, is not able to meet the needs of people. One of the things that happens when Congress is not able to act with dispatch to address things that are actually need to be taken care of is that the president steps in and starts to do things through executive order because the problem has to be solved. We can't let things go indefinitely. Right. And that is also a huge constitutional problem because then all of a sudden we've gotten rid of the entire deliberative process and we're having the executive out there just making decisions. Now, in the past few years, 2 years really, very recently, the Supreme Court has started rolling back a lot of that ability for the president to make those kinds of executive decisions, right, that happened kind of at the end of the Biden administration. But meanwhile, you have the current president doing all sorts of other now executive orders and taking all of which is now entangled in litigation. So part of the problem is Congress needs to be able to act so that it doesn't cause breakdowns in other parts of our system, whether it be the courts making decisions rather than legislation or the president making decisions rather than it going through a regular deliberative legislative process.
Thank you. And this is a citizen's playbook, and they're going to get their homework shortly. But as you look at this episode with the role of Congress and making law, passing law, legislation, and that, what is 1 or 2 things that you would like to leave with our listener on how they can be a part of making this happen? We've talked about the friction. We've talked about Schoolhouse Rocks, and it's an earworm in all of our heads right now. But what are 1 or 2 things that you would recommend for our listeners as a takeaway on how they can be more involved in this role?
Sure. So one of the things people have a lot of questions about is just sort of the basic nuts and bolts of how you influence legislation, how you influence Congress. And everybody should know that it is not some distant thing that is far away from you. You are able to have an enormous impact. When you think about ways to have an impact on the political and policy process, the closer you are, the more you can get eye to eye with a member of Congress or their staff, the more effective you are going to be. Now, sending letters, making calls, all of that is important and okay. But if you can really sit in this day of digital, armies and everything like that, sending an email, I would get lists. I got thousands and thousands of emails and letters a week. The letters were all digitally scanned. My staff would get them, and I would just basically get grids, of the issues and how many people wrote in on it, as opposed to getting what I would have loved to have gotten, sort of that individual letter that I was able to respond to, right? That is not happening. But when people came to my office and sat down and talked with me, that was a real chance for me to interact with people, to hear what was important to them, to hear the intensity of whether it was important or not. So I think to the extent that you can get into the office to convey your concerns one-on-one, that makes a huge difference. Two, the other thing everybody needs to know about is what the legislative process is and sort of how it unfolds. Now, I've talked about it is a mess right now, but there is an underlying structure that still exists. So typically, Congresses, a Congress is a 2-year cycle that starts at the beginning of a House member's term, in essence, right? And it runs for 2 years. So legislation that is introduced in the first year of the Congress continues to exist till the second year. And then all the bills are kind of swept off the table and the Congress starts all over again. Typically what you want to do, right, is in January, February, March of either year, maybe even into April, that is a time where you want to get in front of the member of Congress to try to influence the legislation that is moving through the Congress during that year. And that is called fly-in season. And that is when a lot of interest groups will go around and really intensively lobby their members of Congress to get things moving. Obviously, getting in the door at the beginning of the Congress, right, gives you a longer runway to try to get your legislation through. So that's an important marker. Another important thing to recognize is that there is this underlying appropriations process and budget process. And there are lots of opportunities to try to influence those, to get support for local priorities, to influence sort of how the money flows from the federal government for different priorities. So very important to know the federal budget process. Again, the priorities are set in the first part of the year. In theory, the budget bills come up and are moved through the House and the Senate during the middle of the year, during the summer. The August recess is kind of your last shot to get in front of your member when they're in the district, right, to try to get things in the budget. And then the budget is supposed to be passed by September 30th. And that is the end of the federal fiscal year. October 1st is the beginning of the next fiscal year. So everybody understanding that fiscal cycle, trying to get in your priorities, get your members of Congress to adopt and to say yes to your priorities at the beginning of the year, and then tracking it throughout the rest of the year is something that every citizen kind of needs to be aware of. And that is how they can have an impact on any number of pieces of legislation or on fiscal issues.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Congresswoman Bourdeaux, thank you so much for this invaluable insider's look. And this information is great for all citizens.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
That leads us to this week's call to action, the little homework assignment. Your representative in the House and your 2 senators all have official websites. Your task is to visit one of those websites and find the section that lists which committees they serve on.
Don't just look at the full committee, see what subcommittees they're on. That's where the most specialized work gets done and where your representative has the deepest expertise and influence.
And next time, we're leaving D.C. and heading to Atlanta to look at the Peach State's Playbook, the Georgia Constitution. Thank you for listening to the Citizens Playbook. Have a great week. Thank you for listening to the Citizens Playbook. We want to take a quick moment to extend a special thank you to Georgia Power for their generous support of this entire series. Georgia Power's commitment to our communities goes far beyond delivering reliable energy. They are actively investing in an informed, engaged, and empowered Georgia. Their partnership is what helps us bring these critical civic conversations right to your headphones. We are incredibly grateful for their support. The Citizens Playbook is hosted by Joseph Henning and State Judge Stephen Knights Jr., produced by Trinity Archer. This has been a Henry Chamber Media production, copyright 2026.